Welcome to the first in what may be a series of videos about gear recommendations for people starting out making YouTube content, live streaming, or maybe video podcasting or audio podcasting. In this first video, we're going to be taking a look at the Sony a7 III and whether it's still a good camera to pick up in 2021 for these particular purposes. This camera was all the rage when it released back in 2018. It's a full-frame camera that shoots 4K video and it was reasonably affordable. Has really great autofocus performance, and that was pretty much enough to set it apart for content creators. Even back then, it had some drawbacks, and of course it hasn't necessarily gotten better with age. So in this video, I'm going to talk about whether it's still worth picking one of these up or if you should just go with something different. So let's just talk about the competition real quick. I think the main competitor for the Sony a7 III, especially if you want to get a Sony, if you want full frame and you want something that's relatively affordable, would be the a7C, which came out in mid to late 2020, I believe, and is the same camera more or less than the a7 III, same sensor, and pretty much all of the same specifications, just with a smaller body. There are some really great advantages to getting the a7C over this one, especially if you're going to be recording video as your main use case. The main benefit, well, there's really two main benefits to it. It has a flip out screen, so you can flip the screen all the way over to the front so you can actually see what you're doing if you're recording yourself. The other huge benefit to it is that it has unlimited record times, whereas the a7 III has a 30-minute record limit. Another pretty big advantage of the a7C is they added the eye tracking autofocus to it, whereas the a7 III only has face tracking. So, I mean, it is better, but you could probably still get some pretty decent results with a face tracking autofocus on the a7 III. I think those are basically the three major benefits of the a7C, and they are really compelling benefits. And I would say if you want to buy a new camera and your primary use case is recording yourself as a one-man operator for YouTube or streaming, then probably just go for the a7C. If, however, you can find a good deal on a used a7 III, that might maybe tip the scales in favor of this one over the a7C. It's always good to save some money. There are some compelling advantages to the a7 III over the a7C, especially if you fancy yourself any kind of photographer. While I did mention they do have the same sensor and overall image quality between both cameras is identical, this has a bigger body, so it has more buttons on it. It's got both the aperture dial and the shutter speed dial, where I'm pretty sure the a7C only has one dial that you have to switch back and forth in the menu to control different things. This has the full-size EVF, whereas the a7C has a much smaller EVF. This also has two SD card slots. For video, it doesn't really matter because you don't get like redundant recording on here, but if you do any kind of professional photography, you can save your pictures to both cards simultaneously so you get that backup, which I kind of find gives me some peace of mind. Another advantage to this one in terms of photography capabilities is the maximum shutter speed on here goes to 1/8000, whereas the a7C tops out at 1/4000. So if you do need really fast shutters, you do get a faster shutter on the a7 III. Now let's just focus on this camera in itself and talk about the biggest cons. I've already mentioned that it has a 30-minute record limit, which is a big deal. And I also mentioned that it doesn't have a flip-out screen. You can actually overcome those two obstacles with an external recorder. If you did want to spend an extra $500 or so to get an Atomos Ninja 5 and record on the Ninja 5, then you'll get unlimited record times and you'll also be able to see yourself, obviously. That also solves another big problem with this camera in that whenever you run an HDMI out of this camera to an external monitor, you also lose that real-time face tracking autofocus. For some reason, you just get like the most basic tracking autofocus whenever you output the HDMI signal from this camera. However, if you output HDMI into a recorder and actually use the recorder to record the video, you get that face tracking autofocus back. Let's finish up with the negatives. Another big one for me is overheating. I was kind of surprised that this camera still overheats a lot, especially if you're recording 4K video. So that's a big negative. If you are recording in a hot environment and you are recording in 4K, not only do you have that 30-minute record time, you also could potentially run into some overheating issues. If you only stream with it, so you're not recording, and if you record in 1080p, you most likely won't run into any overheating issues with the camera. The last major con for me with this camera is that the 1080p quality isn't that good. So you have a 24 megapixel sensor So you're getting like 6K's worth, actually more than 6K's worth of resolution that has to be downsampled or downscaled into either 4K or 1080p. We'll talk about the 4K in the positives, but for 1080p, that means either they're line skipping or they're pixel binning. I'm not really sure which one Sony's doing, but that just means it's getting rid of those pixels in a way that's sort of destructive to the image. So you tend to get a lot of aliasing. The image is softer than it otherwise would be. For streaming, it probably doesn't matter because you're losing a lot of quality, with the stream, depending on how high your bit rate is and all that stuff. Just there's a lot of compression and data loss going with streaming, so it probably won't matter. But if you do a lot of recording at 1080p, because the only way you get high frame rates with this camera is in 1080p, the quality isn't as good as some other competing cameras. So that's a lot of negatives, and there are some other good options out there, but there are a lot of positives to this camera even so. And I already referenced it with the negatives, but if you are recording in 4K, it is a really nice 4K image. So you are getting a straight downsample from 6K to 4K. The number 2 positive, and it's pretty self-evident for anybody, is that this is a full frame camera. And for a lot of people, that is a big deal. So there are benefits to full frame. I think it's a little bit overblown a lot of times. But if you are in the market for a full frame camera, here you go. Here's a good option. Number 3 benefit is, while it's not the most up-to-date autofocusing system, it's still a really good autofocusing camera, especially for continuous autofocus for video. It doesn't have eye tracking AF, but it does have face tracking AF. So aside from the latest Sony cameras and Canon cameras, it's probably in the top 3 or 4 best performers for continuous autofocus even now. The number 4 benefit, and I already talked about this a little bit, is it is a really great hybrid camera. So if you do take photographs, this is a really great option. The sensor still is a really great sensor with tons of dynamic range, great low light performance. I also mentioned the fact that it does have dual card slots. The number 5 benefit is good battery life. Comes with the newer Z-style batteries. I think this was the first full frame camera from Sony that came with these batteries. So they're a huge improvement over what came before. Not only that, but it comes with a wall charger that you can power the camera continuously. So if you are a streamer or long form content creator, you can power the camera right from the wall, and it will also charge the battery simultaneously. The next big pro for me is, since it does have that bigger body over the A7C, you do get a lot more customizability. So there's lots of function buttons on this camera that you can program however you want. You also get custom buttons to set up different picture profiles, so you can easily swap back and forth between, say, 4K 24 and then maybe 1080p 60 or 1080p 120. And there's also an S&Q mode, so it kind of gives you, in a sense, about 3 custom profiles. So you can always switch to the S&Q mode to get into a high frame rate. The S&Q is just Sony's high frame rate mode. While this isn't regarded as like the low light beast like the Sony a7S cameras are, it still is a really great low light camera. And the last one, especially if you're looking at full frame mirrorless cameras, Sony has been doing it for longer than Canon, Nikon, and Panasonic. Therefore, there's more lens options. There's more native lens options, and there's also way more third-party lens options available for the Sony E-mount system. So if you do want to get into the native lenses for whatever camera system you buy, then Sony has more. Well, I hope that was helpful. I just wanted to give you a rundown of whether the Sony a7 III is a worthwhile camera to be taking a look at in 2021 for the purpose of creating stuff for YouTube. Again, whether that's videos like this or live streaming, video podcasting, whatever it is you want to do. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and otherwise, we'll just see you in another video.